Let's now return to the previous question, which is still unanswered. What caused the initial collapse of the upper section of the towers onto the rest of the building? As we have seen, there was a bowing of the facade before the collapse, but the trusses didn't have any strength of their own to cause such a massive bending of the external structure. If explosives were used, however, and this part of the core structure was made to collapse first, then the trusses would have had enough strength to pull along the facade and to initiate the global collapse. In fact, it was observed that the antenna from the North Tower begins dropping slightly before the top section of the building collapses, which indicates the central structure was destroyed first. Even though a controlled demolition seems the only valid explanation for the collapses, the debunkers have brought different arguments against this possibility. The first argument is that it would have been impossible to place the explosives under everyone's eyes.
You would take an army of workers. It would take months. So this idea that, some crew dressed in black could sneak in the middle of the night and wire a building like that to be demolished it's absurd.
Ipotizziamo che siano veramente state minate. Come si fa? Entrano di nascosto delle persone, portano dell'esplosivo. Scusi, sa, devo lasciare qui questa serie di zainetti. Non ci faccia caso, poi spariscono.
There are, however, different facts to be considered. The first one is that in the months previous to 9/11, a major renovation of the elevator system in both towers was undertaken. From the March 2001 issue of Elevator World, we read, Ace Elevator undertook what was perhaps one of the largest, most sophisticated elevator modernization programs in the industry's history at New York City's prestigious World Trade Center. No one is suggesting that this company had anything to do with the possible planting of explosives, but such an extensive renovation process would have certainly provided the cover for a special team to access the internal structure of the buildings at any given time. As explained by Richard Heumann, Chief Electrical Engineer for the Twin Towers, the elevator shafts gave direct access to the core columns.
I'm very familiar with the interior structure that surrounded the elevator shafts, and of course their access to the elevator shafts gave them total access to the surrounding core columns, the interior of the core columns.
Secondly, the movement of heavy equipment on floors that were supposedly empty was noticed in the weeks leading up to 9/11. Scott Forbes worked for a financial institution on the 97th floor of the South Tower.
It must have been at least 4 to 6 weeks before 9/11. It was like rebuilding work going on upstairs. The tenants, the people from Aon who had been removed somewhere else, the offices were just vacant. And there was a lot of heavy machinery building work going on. It was almost like pneumatic drills and lots of hammering, so much so that the floors were shaking. That's how noticeable it was. It was almost as if something heavy was being moved and then it was being taken off wheels, and it was like, boom. Our floor underneath literally shook. You could feel the weight above you.
William Rodriguez, an employee at the Twin Towers for more than 20 years, recalls a similar experience.
As I stood there on the 33rd floor, I heard very strange noises on the 34th floor. I heard very heavy equipment being moved around, and it sounded like dumpsters with metal wheels being moved around, and I got scared because I knew it was an empty floor. Nobody was supposed to be there. As a matter of fact, not even the elevators stop there. You have to have a special access key to open the door on the 34th floor.
Thirdly, after the 1993 attack, bomb-sniffing dogs had been adopted in the security system of the Twin Towers. But on Thursday, September the 6th, bomb-sniffing dogs were abruptly removed, according to a security guard, with no apparent reason. And lastly, there was an unprecedented power down in the South Tower on the very weekend before 9/11. For the first time in 30 years, all the security systems in the building had become useless at the same time. People could come and go as they pleased, even in protected areas, without being seen nor recorded by surveillance cameras.
The previous weekend, there had been a power down. Because of the power down, there was a complete breakdown of security that weekend. We had guided tours coming into secured areas by mistake and nobody picking it up because there's no intrusion alarms or anything else.
Scott Forbes was also present during the power down.
There was a power down in the South Tower on the weekend of the 8th and 9th of September. it wouldn't have just have affected camera security. It would have affected all the secure systems on doors for either key locks or security badges and so on. To undo them, they weren't working because they're all powered by electricity, so there was no power, there was no backup system, therefore they were all open.
What again was the excuse that the Port Authority gave you, Scott, for this 36-hour period of the power being down in the South Tower?
The explanation was that there was a recabling exercise to increase the bandwidth of networks that were available in the towers. But what I can recall is that there were plenty of toolboxes, there were plenty of spools of cable, there were men around wearing overalls. They appeared to be like engineers. At the time, it seemed perfectly legitimate what they were doing because this was the story we were given, that there was a recabling exercise.
The debunkers are right. It would have been very difficult to bring in the explosives without being noticed. But with the proper cover story, it could have been done under everyone's eyes, in full daylight, without anybody even questioning what was going on. Another argument by the debunkers is that controlled demolitions, they say, always begin from the bottom, while the destruction of the Twin Towers clearly started from the top.
Controlled demolitions always begin from the bottom of the building. You cut the bottom columns and then the building falls. If you look at the World Trade Centers, both of them began at the impact wounds where the planes hit.
Il crollo da torre parte dall'alto, mentre nelle esplosioni controllate parte sempre dal basso. Si demoliscono le fondamenta, poi si va su e la torre, il palazzo che deve essere demolito, crolla subito.
But this is not true. Every controlled demolition can be designed according to the needs. In fact, sometimes it's not a good idea to start from the bottom. This brings us directly to the issue of explosions. In the same interview where he praised the solidity of the Twin Towers, John Skilling stated, "I'm not saying that properly applied explosives, shaped explosives of that magnitude could not do a tremendous amount of damage. I would imagine that if you took the top expert in that type of work and gave him the assignment of bringing these buildings down with explosives, I would bet that he could do it." On September 11, there were dozens and dozens of loud explosions reported by firefighters, policemen, journalists, and regular citizens, both before and during the collapse of both towers. For all these explosions, however, the debunkers have a blanket explanation. The witnesses were confused. They were not real explosions.
È interessante notare che tutti i testimoni che parlano di esplosioni le hanno sentite, nessuno le ha mai viste.
There are things that happened inside the building, pieces coming loose as a result of the extreme impact, very well may have been interpreted as explosion.
Molto spesso i profani parlano di explosion, ma non intendono strettamente la carica di dinamite che fa boom. Parlano di botto, di boato, e il boato può essere dovuto a tante ragioni.
What's an explosion sound like? Most people don't know because most people have never heard one. So any sharp, loud bang, that's probably an explosion.
The fact is, most of the explosions were reported by firefighters and policemen, and no one knows how to recognize an explosion in a burning building better than they do.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion. Everybody just started running for the door. Everybody was trapped.
New York's bravest never had a chance. We really never even got to that close to the building. An explosion blew and it knocked everybody over.
The whole time you hear boom, 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 boom. So I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
In August 2005, the New York Times published 12,000 pages of oral histories rendered in the voices of 503 firefighters and emergency personnel who were present at the Trade Center on September 11. Over 100 of them, 1/5 of the total, has reported explosions in the buildings prior or during the collapses. Regular citizens also seem quite capable of telling an explosion from a simple object falling to the ground.
Something, either they blew the lobby up or something, because it blew the glass out of the doors and knocked us all down, and I got smoke and everything on me. I just feel a little shook up because I got blasted, So.
Before proceeding, one thing should be known about controlled demolitions. Just like the Twin Towers, most modern buildings are built with a high redundancy factor in terms of structural strength. For this reason, a series of preliminary explosions is normally needed in controlled demolitions to weaken the structure before the actual collapse can be induced. Obviously, in the case of the Twin Towers, it would not have been possible to set off the preliminary explosions all at once, just before the collapse. To make them less noticeable, it would have been wise to set them off at separate intervals, any time between the impacts of the planes and the collapse of the towers. For this reason, it's important to keep in mind the exact chronology of the events. 8:46, first impact into the North Tower. 9:03, second impact into the South Tower. 9:59, collapse of the South Tower. 10:28, collapse of the North Tower. 5:20 in the afternoon, collapse of Building 7. Witnesses normally call first explosion the one that came with the impact of the planes, while they call secondary explosions all those that took place in separate moments between the impacts of the planes and the collapse of the two towers.
We got that first secondary explosion really got us spooked because we were in the building.
Then there was secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted.
According to several witnesses, there was a secondary explosion that took place in the basement of the North Tower just before the plane hit the building.
At 8:30, he says he was headed to level B4 in Tower 1, 4 stories below ground.
I go downstairs, the foreman tells me to go to remove the containers. As I'm walking by the main freight car of the building, in the corridor, that's when I got blown. I mean, the impact of the explosion, of whatever happened, it threw me to the floor.
Morelli then remembers a second explosion, separate from the first.
I was racing, I was going towards the bathroom. All of a sudden, I opened the door, I didn't know it was a bathroom, and all of a sudden, a big impact happened again. And all the ceiling tile was falling down, the light fixtures were falling.
According to the 9/11 Commission, it was the jet fuel pouring down the elevator shafts that caused the explosion in the basement. From the final report we read, a jet fuel fireball erupted upon impact and shot down at least one bank of elevators. The fireball exploded onto numerous lower floors, including the B4 level, 4 stories below the ground. But the witnesses described an explosion that took place in the basement before the impact of the plane.
Very strong. Boom! An explosion so hard that pushed us upwards. Upwards. And it came from the basement between the B2 level and the B3 level. And at that moment, I thought it was the mechanical room where they have all the pumps and the generators for the building, that maybe a generator just blew up on the basement. Now, 20 years in the building, you know something that comes from the bottom and something that comes from the top. And when I went to verbalize that it was a generator, we hear, boom, all the way on the top, the impact of the plane on the top. 2 different events, 2 different times.
There are others who remember several explosions after the one from below.
It came from, I believe, at first we believed that it came from the mechanical room. Then we heard a series of other explosions that sounded up on the above levels of the building.
I was in the B4 level, and on my way, I heard a bomb. So I says, probably the transformer again blew up. So I stepped back, finished what I had to finish, and I started towards the door again. And there come a big blast with a big ball of fire.
The 2 separate explosions were recorded at a distance of about 9 seconds from each other during a business meeting that was taking place in a building nearby, 1 Liberty Plaza.
Sound like something crashed.
When faced with this precise question, the editors of Popular Mechanics chose not to answer it, and fell back on the generic explanation of the jet fuel in the elevator shafts.
Ask what your guys' explanation is for Willie Rodriguez's testimony that he heard, experienced, and his coworkers were actually burned by an explosion in the basement of the North Tower prior to the plane hitting, and this has been verified by at least 20 different eyewitnesses.
Jim X of Papa Mechanics.
When the plane struck the buildings, they penetrated the internal core. Jet fuel poured down stairwells and elevator shafts, setting off secondary explosions. Not to mention the horrific impact of these fully loaded planes hitting the structure and causing enormous swaying.
It's interesting to note too that
you still didn't address the fact that it was before
Empire State Building crash back in 1945.
But the explanation of the jet fuel in the elevator shafts has several problems of its own. First of all, there were no regular elevators connecting the basement to the top levels of the towers. Each tower consisted of 3 separate buildings, built on top of one another, each with their own elevator system. There were only 2 elevators connecting the lobby to the 44th and 78th floor. But the plane struck on the 95th floor, which means the fuel could not have poured down these elevator shafts. There were only 2 banks of elevators that went all the way from the basement to the top of the towers, and they were mostly used by maintenance people. In one of these elevators was Arturo Griffith.
Well, I was on my way from B2 to 49th floor.
Not only didn't Griffith get cremated by this supposed ball of fire, but he also remembers 3 separate explosions.
And there was a loud explosion and the elevator dropped. When the elevator finally stopped, they had an explosion that bring the doors inside the elevator. And then they had another explosion on the panel that threw me, against the wall.
Most importantly, the theory of the jet fuel in the elevator shafts fails to take into consideration the volumes involved. Each tower had an approximate volume of 2,160,000 cubic yards. The planes that hit the towers carried an estimated 10,000 gallons of fuel each at the time of impact. 10,000 gallons is the equivalent of 50 cubic yards. This in-scale graphic shows what 50 cubic yards looked like next to the volume of the tower. Assuming that about half of the fuel was consumed in the initial explosion, we would be left with some 25 cubic yards of fuel available. But most of this fuel is needed to ignite the fires at different floors, as explained by Mr. Meggs himself.
Jets crashed into buildings. They crashed at an angle, which meant that their wings, which is where they store most of their fuel, cut through multiple floors. So they splashed fuel and debris across multiple floors of the building, igniting fires.
So even assuming that, for some strange reason, 5 of those cubic yards were all to end up in the only elevator shaft that goes all the way to the bottom of the tower, there wouldn't be enough to reach the basement in significant quantities. Your typical 10-foot by 30-inch backyard pool contains roughly 1,000 gallons of water, which is the equivalent of 5 cubic yards. Imagine dumping the water from this pool into this kind of elevator shaft with a drop of more than 1,000 feet below, and you'll get the idea of how much fuel can actually reach the bottom. In any case, the fuel in the elevator shafts theory could never account for the powerful explosion that literally devastated the lobby of the North Tower 1 hour after the first impact and before the collapse of the South Tower.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then somebody said that they saw an airliner going to one of those towers. Then, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that.
In fact, these firemen reported 3 large explosions in Tower 1, which took place after the plane's impact. They also confirmed it was the 3rd explosion to devastate the lobby of the tower.
It was an explosion. It was in the lobby, and the 3rd explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What you told me is that there was a plane or whatever hit the building, then a secondary explosion.
It was like 3 explosions after that. We came in after the fire. We came when the fire was going on already. We was in the staging area inside the building, waiting to go upstairs. And they exploded. The whole lobby collapsed on the lobby inside.
It took these witnesses about 1 hour to walk down from the 82nd floor to the lobby of the North Tower after the impact of the plane.
We got to the 4th floor from 82nd floor.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby with this big explosion. I don't know if
everything went
just like what you just seen. That's what we went through before we came out of the building. Then when we get out the building, then another smoke cloud came.
A similar story here. The long descent from Tower 1 and the big explosion in the lobby.
It was like holy hell coming down them stairs. And then when we finally got to the bottom, they were coming out on the mezzanine level there, and another explosion came right from it because everyone flying.
Yet another similar story.
Big boom, come down the steps, everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped on there with another guy, crawled out, kept getting hit in the head, had bags rolled around, finally we clawed our way out over the rubble.
The situation in the lobby was such that there was no doubt on what had happened.
The ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
We ran down the steps to the lobby. There was no lobby. Everything was torn up.
We came outside the lobby. There was no lobby. The lobby was totally gone.
Did you see other people?
People. There was a woman there with her face blown off.
Big glass lobby, and all the glass was broken. Wires hanging from the ceiling, the signs that would hang above telling you where to go were all hanging. It was unbelievably scary to look at.
Firefighter John Schroeder was climbing the stairs of Tower 1 when he heard the huge explosion from below.
We were heading up to the 24th floor of the stairwell, and all of a sudden our building got rocked. We got bounced around in the stairwell like pinballs, man. And we just said, you know what? Time to go. We came down, it looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. Everything was exploded, everything was gone. We're like, what is going on here? For every window in the lobby to be exploded. I mean, them windows were like as thick as forget it. They were 2-3 inch glasses, you know, come on. They exploded out of the lobby. You know, it wasn't from the jet fuel. No way.
Then we have the accounts from those who heard explosions moments before the South Tower collapsed. John McLaughlin was a police officer for the Port Authority.
Going into Tower 1, we heard a loud explosion coming from the area of Building 2, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
We saw the top begin to blow out in a plume of smoke, and we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions, 3 thuds, and turned around to see the building we just got out of, antenna tip over and fall in on itself.
And then all of a sudden, 3 tremendous explosions, and everything started coming down.
Then there was a tight sequence of detonations during the collapse of the South Tower, which many described as firecrackers.
You heard a big explosion before the building fell?
I saw it as it was happening, and it sounded as if you had 100 of those little black cat firecrackers and you lit them all off at once. That's what it sounded like. It sounded like the finale of the 4th of July.
As the first tower came down, there were a series of explosions. It was like boom, boom. You could hear the echoes of the explosions echoing off the different buildings.
The detonation started, and they went boom, boom, boom. They were a little less than a second apart.
Below the fire, I saw from the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. Just
They were planning to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom. All the way down.
So it was like boom, 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 boom.
From far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
The same kind of detonations were heard during the collapse of the North Tower.
Second tower, number 1, the second tower collapsed. It was the exact same series of detonations.
And then it sounded like firecrackers. Crack, 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 crack. And we looked up, and the second tower was coming down.
The debunkers doubt that there were explosions, they say, because no explosions were recorded in the videos from the collapses.
Le demolizioni fanno rumore, fanno dei botti estremamente precisi, fortissimi come li avete sentiti. Come mai nelle immagini delle torri gemelle non ci sono le esplosioni, ma c'è un solo boato continuo?
Lorsqu'il y a une explosion, on la ressent. On la ressent comme il faut. Ça se mesure, on l'enregistre. Aucune base de son ne les enregistre. Aucune.
First of all, the debunkers forget that most of the television shots were taken from a distance with long telephoto lenses, and they don't carry the actual sound from the towers. While in the videos shot by amateurs, the soundtrack is usually covered by the screams of those standing around the camera. In any case, it's not true that no explosions were recorded by video cameras. In this shot, for example, a series of loud concussions can be heard just before the collapse begins. On the left, covered by smoke, is the South Tower moments before the collapse. In this shot by ABC television, the initial explosion can also be heard. Listen carefully after the words FBI agents.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents. Towers, a huge explosion now waiting to play on all of us.
The explosion can be heard even better by separating the stereo track of the microphone from the one of the camera.
Here, the police officers, FBI agents. Here, the police officers, FBI agents.
The same explosion can be heard in the same clip used in a PBS documentary.
But a key question remained. Did their ultimate failure? But a key question remained. Did their ultimate failure?
And then there were several explosions recorded after both towers had collapsed, like this one from this BBC video.
This one was recorded after both of the twin towers had collapsed and before Tower 7's collapse.
Amateurs also kept recording explosions after the collapse of both towers.
It's now 11 o'clock. Still hear continuing explosions, but there's another explosion.
This recording was made between 10 and 11 o'clock. The explosion came from the direction of Building 7.
Right now. You gotta get back from here. You know that. You gotta get back. I know.
In fact, a big explosion in Building 7 was reported before either tower had collapsed. Sometime after 9 o'clock, Barry Jennings was descending the stairs of Building 7, trying to reach street level.
Well, me and Mr. Hess, the Corporation Counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor.
Jennings was trapped in the building for several hours, together with his colleague, Michael Hess.
Mr. Hess! 8th floor. 8th floor, 7 World Trade. I pass the word!
After they were rescued by the fire department, Mr. Hess confirmed the big explosion on the 8th floor.
So, Mr. Hess, you were trapped in, I believe, 7 World Trade Center. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I was. I was up in the Emergency Management Center on the 23rd floor. Another gentleman and I walked down to the 8th floor where there was an explosion.
In a later interview, Jennings has confirmed the explosion took place before either tower had collapsed.
Both buildings were still standing. I was trapped in there for several hours. I was trapped in there when both buildings came down.
While he was trapped, Jennings kept hearing more explosions.
All this time, I'm hearing all types of explosions.
In fact, explosions near Building 7 were recorded up to a few minutes before the building collapsed. And finally, there is also someone who saw an explosion up close, through his very eyes. It's Ron DiFrancesco, the same person who had descended from the 91st floor of the South Tower all the way to the lobby.
When he was exiting the building, he heard an explosion. He spun around, and a fireball was coming down the hallway at him. He put his arms up, blew him across Church Street. He woke up in the hospital 2 days later.
Yeah, I had burns, they say, on 80% of my body, and I have a broken bone in my back, and I guess my ears were turned inside out just with the burns. My head was very swollen. You know, I had my contacts in, so they were melted to my eyes, and...
To doubt the content of all these accounts does not mean to have debunked the claims of explosions. It means to willfully ignore dozens and dozens of dramatic testimonies which describe a story of September 11 quite different from the one we have been told so far. Question. Given that after the initial explosion and the ensuing fires, there wouldn't have been enough jet fuel left to pour down the elevator shafts in substantial quantities, can you explain the at least 3 separate explosions reported by multiple witnesses at the time of the first impact in the North Tower? In particular, can you explain the huge explosion reported by multiple witnesses in the basement of the North Tower moments before the impact of the plane? Can you explain what caused the huge explosion that literally devastated the lobby of the North Tower, according to multiple witnesses, about 1 hour after the impact of the plane and before the collapse of Tower 2? Can you explain what caused the big explosion reported by Mr. Jennings and Mr. Hess on the 8th floor of Building 7 before either tower had collapsed? Can you explain what caused the multiple explosions recorded by different camera crews, including the BBC and CNN, after the towers had collapsed and before the collapse of Building 7? Can you explain how more than 100 witnesses, most of them firefighters and policemen, could have all been mistaken in reporting explosions at the Twin Towers on September 11? Another element suggesting controlled demolitions are the so-called squibs, the puffs of debris that were noticed on the sides of both towers as the collapses took place. Squibs occur in controlled demolitions when concrete is forcefully expelled from the building by the explosions occurring inside.
The individual explosions that I noticed 20 and 30 and 40 stories below the collapsing structure, those are what we demolitions guys call squibs. And that's another characteristic that seems to be evident.
But for the squibs in the Twin Towers, the debunkers have a different explanation.
A building like that, it's like a giant accordion. It's full of air. When the top of that building comes down, all that air has to come out. And where it comes out the windows. It blows out the windows.
Quanto agli sbuffi, se pensiamo a questi piani che si schiacciano uno sull'altro, l'aria che esce, che porta polvere, fumo e detriti fuori, li spiega abbastanza bene.
The debunkers forget that several squibs were observed 20, 30, or 40 floors below the level of the collapse, in an area where the floors above were still perfectly intact. There is no smoke or concrete to be pushed out here when the collapse has only reached this level at this point. But even in this case, the debunkers have an explanation.
Et ça s'explique justement par la communication des surpressions, par les cages d'ascenseur. Alors là, c'est les cages d'ascenseur, mais il y a bien sûr aussi des escaliers. Donc ça aussi, et ça a permis donc cette évacuation de l'air, non seulement sur les côtés, mais aussi dans toute la tour, en mettant en pression le bâtiment.
But elevators and stairs have doors at almost every floor. Had there been such a strong compression from above, it would have pushed with equal force on all the floors below, not just the one where the squib occurred. In any case, this is clearly not broken glass. Glass fragments from a window would not even be visible from such a distance. These are high-speed ejections of concrete and other solid debris, which can only be explained by a powerful explosion having occurred nearby. There is even one case in which the expulsion of material, and possibly a human being, takes place before the collapse has begun. Question. Given that what we see is clearly not glass from a broken window, but concrete and other debris, can you explain what caused the squibs observed 30 or 40 floors below the level of collapse? Technically speaking, squibs are just a particular case of explosions occurring below the level of collapse. But powerful ejections of concrete and other material have been observed throughout the entire collapse of both towers. The result of such explosive force is the lateral ejection of large chunks of the external structure all around the towers.
The spread of debris in a large radius around each tower. What we see is an outward explosion of material beyond the perimeters of each footprint.
FEMA has documented a 1,200-foot diameter debris area around each tower where major chunks of the buildings were found. This means that parts of the structure were ejected laterally at a distance twice as large as the width of the tower itself.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
The debunkers contend that the material ejected laterally was only the aluminum foil covering the structure, not the steel beams themselves.
Ces éléments qui sont là, certains disent, vous vous rendez compte des poutres qui font plusieurs tonnes? Non, ça c'est pas des poutres qui font plusieurs tonnes, c'est tout simplement le parement qui était prévu sur les tours, qui étaient des plaques d'aluminium qui étaient collées sur les poutres en acier. Les poutres en acier, elles sont là et là. Ça c'est juste des choses très légères qui ont volé, comme tout à l'heure ma touillette à café. Voilà. Voilà.
Kiran is mistaken. The chunks of material being hurtled hundreds of feet away are not just aluminum covering. They are the same prefabricated blocks of steel structure used to build the two towers. In this case, a person who has remained attached to a block of columns falling can give us an idea of the structural pieces being detached from the building. Several large chunks of structure ended up embedded in buildings nearby. David Chandler of Architects and Engineers has calculated the energy needed to hurtle some of these chunks of structure to such a distance from the buildings.
Using special software, we can analyze motion on video clips frame by frame. I have placed markers on each frame so we can track a particular projectile. From the markers, we can get a data table and plot various graphs. The data here shows that the object we were tracking was shot horizontally at over 70 miles per hour. The energy needed to hurl a 4-ton girder at this speed is comparable to the energy needed to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles.
Question. Given that the falling upper sections of the towers had no additional energy to destroy the healthy structure below, where did the energy to hurtle these large chunks of structure at such a distance from the towers come from? Once the smoke had settled and the recovery work commenced, more evidence pointing at controlled demolitions started to emerge. One example are the supporting columns cut at a 45-degree angle that were noticed sticking out of the ground. This kind of cut is typical of controlled demolitions and is obtained by placing linear charges on the columns at a 45-degree angle.
Now this is a linear shaped charge and it's wired in with the dynamite. When it cuts, it'll cut this column right on this angle, and then this piece will be deflected and displaced in that direction.
Some of those cuts on the larger chunks of the structure, called candlesticks, were made by iron workers during the removal operations. But cut columns were noticed on the very evening of September 11, far before the removal operations had started.
You know, this is the first day in a pile. You know, actually, it was on the 11th. It was 8 o'clock at night, and we had a hunt for iron workers. But meanwhile, there was tons and tons of beams that were cut with no settling to be had, nor iron workers to do the work. It's just physically not possible to cut that much steel in that amount of time, especially with no one to operate the equipment. It just didn't add up.
When asked about the presence of columns cut at a 45-degree angle, Danilo Coppe, Italy's foremost expert in controlled demolitions, stated, "I'll confess, this is extremely curious from a technical point of view, as this is a very similar result to the one obtained with cutting charges." Another kind of cut commonly used in controlled demolitions is the so-called V-cut.
This little V here gives it a place to slide off. That's all it does. And by putting them on at this diagonal, we're trying to fill this structure in this direction.
A large V-cut is visible on this chunk of structure from Building 7. The same chunk exhibits also a 45-degree angle diagonal cut on the cross beam, with a lighter V-cut at the end of the other beam. Can you suggest a good reason why ironworkers would need to perform V-cuts and a 45-degree cut on this piece of structure just to remove it from the rubble? Another element suggesting the use of explosives is the complete disappearance of the hat trusses, the large steel structures that connected and bound the towers from above. The hat trusses covered an area of 1 acre in size and sat on the very top of each building. There was nothing above that could have crushed them except for the antenna on the north tower, which in fact was supported by the hat truss. If a simple gravitational collapse had occurred, one would expect to find the hat trusses sitting on top of the rubble, partially deformed maybe, but still recognizable. Instead, both steel structures, each 1 acre in size, seem to have vanished into thin air. From the hundreds of pictures taken at ground zero, including the aerial shots, no recognizable section of the hat trusses seems to be visible. Curiously, the antenna from the north tower was found, deformed but still recognizable. But the hat trusses which bound the towers together and supported the antenna seem to have vanished completely.